Hello and welcome to Charlie's Literary Chatter podcast. Today we're going to be talking about part of the Victorian era and the literature of the time, including some of the qualities and examples of those qualities that really encompassed the Victorian era and its literature. The Victorian era lasted from around 1830 to 1901 and was largely characterized by the values and beliefs of Queen Victoria herself, for whom the age was named. This era was fairly polarizing, with industrialization on the rise. It led to a very distinct class structure, and apart from the social and political aspects of the Victorian age, there was also a kind of almost self-examination and evaluation within the literature of this age. One of the defining themes of Victorian novels are protagonists who are creating themselves, finding themselves in the world, especially in relation to, obviously, Victorian politics and such. So we see that as a common theme throughout all of the stories that we're going to be talking about today, is just people really trying to figure out who they are emotionally and socially. Something else that we're going to see quite a bit in Victorian era literature is going to be this sort of rushed, this pace that really shows people sort of searching for change very quickly. This is because a lot of the authors of this age sensed an impending, almost sort of doom in society. They were worried that society would become overwhelmed and deteriorate almost into anarchy or something of the sort. So you can see this through how not only how the authors write these stories, but how the characters act within them, seeing how they're trying to change the world and themselves. And especially towards the end of this era, we're going to see some major reflection, usually through satire, that really examines some of the values that used to be displayed in society that are now being sort of criticized after these people have realized the sort of pretentious values and ideas of their past. Now, the Victorian age is split into about three rough periods. These are mostly social, sort of political periods, but I think we can use them in order to look at our literature in the context of the age a little bit better. So we have the early period, the mid period, and the late period. And these show three different stages in the lifestyle and thinking of people within the Victorian age. And so let's start with the early period and use it to examine something that many people know and love, A Christmas Carol. We can use the time of the Victorian age to kind of contextualize why this story that we know and love has characters and events that behave the way that they do. I'm going to be using A Christmas Carol to talk about the qualities of the early period of the Victorian era. Now, I am aware that A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens it was not published during the early period. It was actually published towards the end of the Victorian age as a whole, but I think that the characters and the setting in general and situations in this story really exemplify a lot of qualities of the early period. So we are going to be using that as sort of a lens to look at that. The early period of the Victorian era was mainly defined by the rise of industrialization in England. This led to a much higher number of factories and mines, and thus a much larger number of workers that were required to keep those sorts of things in business. This included women and children, and all or most of these workers were working under some pretty terrible conditions. And it led to a very large rift between social classes in England during this time. It led to a wealthy group and a more poor working class group that really you can see much more of a separation within this time. In fact, in A Christmas Carol, during Stave 1, Scrooge himself says, "Merry Christmas? What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." Unquote. I think this really shows the mindset that once you're poor, you're really in a sort of terrible position in this age, and it's very hard to get out of, as well as the mindset of the wealthy people of this time really looking down upon the lower class, and the disconnect between these two classes. As we know throughout the story, Scrooge has a change of heart, and he sees the good in family bonds and places less importance on his monetary worth and more on his emotional worth, which is really more of a late Victorian sort of idea, which you can see by the fact that this was published in 84, I believe. So this really shows a good span of the Victorian age and the qualities of that rift between the wealthy and the poor, as well as the sort of emotional growth that we have here as we change from a sort of very monetarily focused sort of England to a, at least in literature, emotionally focused England. Moving on to the mid-Victorian period, we see more of a clashing between what was used to be believed and what is starting to be discovered, especially in science and thoughts of religion in this time. But this can also be shown socially, and I think that is best portrayed through what we have read by Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest. Are you tired of reading your favorite stories, putting them down to go run an errand, and then coming back and not knowing where you left off? Well, now you have nothing to fear. Introducing bookmarks. We can serve you with a bookmark that will save your spot in your favorite reading. These bookmarks are irreplaceable, and you cannot use something like a scrap piece of paper or a receipt from Walmart to mark your page. No, call 1-800-BOOKMARKS, and we will sell you a $20 bookmark so that you can finally have the reading experience you deserve. This is definitely not a ripoff. Thank you for listening to our ad, and call 1-800-BOOKMARKS to get a bookmark today. Now back to your regularly scheduled programming. The Importance of Being Earnest is largely a comedy and is mostly satire in nature, and I think that is very helpful for us to understand the period in which it is representing. Mostly, I think we can see this through the butting of heads between Jack and his Aunt Augusta, or Lady Bracknell. They are really a representation of the old versus new beliefs. Jack has very new ideas. He wants to follow his pursuits of love with Gwendolyn, and he just wants to be a man of the new world, essentially, whereas Lady Bracknell is sort of set in her beliefs and her values and represents a sort of older England, really, and she does not want Jack to be married to Gwendolyn because he does not have a known lineage, which is the crux of the story here. And that is really a good representation of Victorian literature and times as a whole here, as it shows that struggle between, not even between different people, but between the self of what should be believed. This is especially displayed within the story, I think, in the first act, in which Jack is asking for Gwendolyn's hand in marriage, and Lady Bracknell responds with, quote, "You can hardly imagine that I and Lord Bracknell would dream of allowing our only daughter, a girl brought up with the utmost care, to marry into a cloakroom and form an alliance with a parcel," unquote. This is a really good quote to look at for the characterization of Lady Bracknell herself, and also that Old English sort of values. It shows the importance that is placed on status and lineage, and it really shows the difference as well between old and new England sort of fighting in ideals during this Victorian age, with Lady Bracknell and Jack not really seeing eye to eye on what would make a good husband in this story. And by Act 3 of the play, we see obviously that Jack and Gwendolyn are to be married through a very comedic sort of conclusion of him discovering his lineage, but I think this is a really good sort of jab at Old English values here, and the sort of silliness from Jack's point of view about the older values, really showing us being ushered in to a new period of thinking and of society in this Victorian era. The reason that I chose these two stories, A Christmas Carol and The Importance of Being Earnest, for this analysis is because I think they both display ideas from multiple periods within this Victorian age. I used A Christmas Carol to display some conditions of the early period, but I also hinted that I thought it displayed ideas from later Victorian England as well. And I think this is also true for The Importance of Being Earnest. As I mentioned, the beginning of A Christmas Carol starts with a lot of early period struggles with poor workers and social standings and emotional turmoil, essentially. But by the end of the story, we see a lot of late Victorian reflection, where we're through Scrooge, we are evaluating the place in society of some of these characters. which is really important for the late period. I think this is also very true through the importance of being earnest. We see a lot of satire, which is a very, I think, late period sort of heavy medium. We see, again, just this, the mid period is a fighting of values, and the late period is an examination of that sort of struggle here. And we see that in the end of both of these stories, with Scrooge coming to terms with the fact that Christmas is about more than money and is about love and friendship and family, and with Jack and Algernon examining the sort of societal systems that have been put in place that have prevented and then allowed their marriages to their respective wives. They are both very different stories that go about this in very different ways, with A Christmas Carol being much more somber almost and serious, and The Importance of Being Earnest being very comedic and more of a criticism, I would say. But they get to essentially the same point by the end of these stories, where we're looking back at the conditions and the society that is in place, and we are rejecting it almost. So, in review, both of these stories that we've talked about today, A Christmas Carol and The Importance of Being Earnest, show a lot of different qualities about the Victorian age as a whole. And we can look at it through the lens of the different periods of the Victorian age, but really, I think they're both a great mix of all sorts of the struggles and the characterizations of this age, from industrialization to political and social divides, to the reflections that are had between people and within people, as well as we can see the different writing styles of the Victorian age, with both of these stories being very different in the way that they portray their messages. So I hope that you found this educational and entertaining. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Charlie's Literary Chatter podcast, and I surely hope to see you next week. Okay, bye.